I remember the exact moment I first heard of the Library of the Missing, an odd rumor mentioned offhand by an eccentric professor during a casual conversation in a dimly lit cafe. The smell of old books clinging to his sweater, even though we were miles away from campus, and something in his eyes made me realize that, behind his half-smile, he held stories far stranger than any lecture hall gossip. I was a graduate student at the time, burdened with academic pressures and a mild obsession with arcane mysteries, so the notion of a hidden library that allegedly swallowed readers whole got stuck in my mind, refusing to let go even when I tried to dismiss it as mere folklore. The professor had said it existed somewhere in a forgotten district, its name whispered by archivists and genealogists who stumbled upon fragments of references in dusty tomes, though no official record acknowledged its presence, as if the building itself defied cartography. For weeks, I found myself combing through library catalogs and newspaper archives, searching for any mention of that place, only to hit dead ends every time, my frustration mingling with a morbid curiosity that spurred me onward. Friends warned me that such a fixation could harm my thesis progress, but I brushed them off, feeling a magnetic pull each time I recalled the professor's cryptic mention of how the Library of the Missing got its name from all the people rumored never to return once they stepped inside. Late nights became my norm, hunched over microfilm reels, scanning headlines from decades past, scouring the lines for clues, until I found a single reference, an obituary notice that mentioned a reclusive scholar vanished under bizarre circumstances after proclaiming he'd found the entrance to the last library. Adrenaline spiked through me, and from that moment, I channeled every spare minute into unraveling the location of this so-called final repository of lost knowledge, a place that might grant me the greatest discovery of my academic life or else devour me as it had others. Eventually, a pattern emerged, scattered accounts describing an unmarked building with architectural styles from multiple eras fused together, located in shifting neighborhoods, as though the library itself was a wandering labyrinth, its facade morphing with each generation. My pulse raced each time I stumbled across a new clue, an old photograph of a windowless structure looming at the edge of an alley, or a line in a centuries-old journal claiming a room full of silent books that thirst for readers. Rumors suggested that once you entered, you might become entranced by the labyrinthine shelves, forgetting time, forgetting even your own life, until the library claimed you as one more lost traveler, your footprints fading in corridors that real estate records insisted did not exist. While the rational part of me insisted this was all an elaborate hoax, a web spawned by imaginative minds enthralled by the mystique of hidden libraries, I couldn't shake the sense that something tangible lurked beneath these tall tales, beckoning me like a silent invitation I both feared and craved. One evening, my investigations led me to an antiquarian bookstore run by a stooped old man whose eyes gleamed with recognition when I asked about the Library of the Missing. And though he feigned ignorance, I caught a tremor in his voice as though he dreaded invoking the place's name. Reluctantly, he directed me to a battered ledger in the store's back room, warning me to read only by the flicker of a single candle to respect the book's frail condition, advice that sounded more ritualistic than practical. Page after page recounted odd anecdotes, a traveling monk centuries ago who compiled forbidden manuscripts in a secret room, a charitable mission that mysteriously vanished from city records after opening a reading hall for the poor, and an underground warren of catacombs that might connect to a library not meant for mortal eyes. My skin prickled each time the ledger mentioned readers hearing disembodied whispers from within walls lined with books, or glimpsing shadowy figures that flickered just out of sight, as though the library's inhabitants stretched across more than one plane of existence. The old bookstore owner insisted he had no further leads, yet he refused to let me leave without a warning. He had encountered a woman once, silent and pale, who emerged from a hidden library's side door only to mutter that the pages watch, before collapsing in a catatonic state, never to speak again. Sleep came fitfully after that, my dreams plagued by visions of endless shelves, each crammed with volumes that had no titles, their spines blank yet humming with a soft rustle, as though the words inside were alive and yearning for an unwary reader to release them. My nights blurred into anxious searching, scouring the city's forgotten alleys, each dead end fueling my frustration, until one moonless evening I wandered into a dilapidated neighborhood I'd never seen before, though logically it should have been just a few blocks from my campus. There, nestled between two crumbling buildings, stood a tall, windowless structure with an ornate wooden door that exuded a quiet menace, the lamplight overhead revealing faint carvings of serpents coiling around an open book. My heart thundered when I realized this might be it, and though caution screamed at me to flee, I found myself crossing the threshold, the door groaning in protest as I pushed it open, revealing a dim foyer that smelled of old parchment and damp stone. Stepping inside, I was struck by the oppressive hush as though the air itself held its breath, and I saw row upon row of bookshelves stretching beyond normal sight. disappearing into gloom that pulsed with flickering candlelight from sconces affixed to pillars shaped like leering gargoyles. At first, I felt a rush of euphoria. Here, at last, was the library of the missing, an impossible trove of arcane volumes that might yield secrets no living scholar had ever uncovered. But that thrill curdled into dread when I noticed the flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. Every corner I glimpsed revealed new shelves leading to corridors that branched into side rooms, each lined floor to ceiling with books bearing cryptic runes on their spines, none of which resembled any alphabet I knew. The hush was so complete that my own footsteps echoed like thunder, and occasionally I swore I heard faint footsteps echoing back, never aligning with my own stride, as if someone or something moved among the stacks, watching me. A single desk stood near the entrance, behind which an impossibly tall figure in a tattered librarian's robe loomed, hunched over a massive ledger. Yet when I approached, the figure turned, revealing a face obscured by a veil of dust, eyes hollow as if no soul resided within. My heart seized as it gestured for me to sign the ledger, a quill pen resting in an inkwell that smelled faintly of rotted leaves. And though my hand shook, I wrote my name with a flourish, as if compelled by a dream logic that demanded compliance. The figure bowed slightly and then vanished into an adjacent aisle, leaving me alone, a creeping sense of entrapment winding around my chest. For now I was not just a curious visitor, but a documented presence, claimed by the library's ledger. I ventured deeper, each step unveiling more curious volumes. Thick grimoires with covers of unidentifiable leather, diaries labeled with names of people from across centuries, some with pages that glowed faintly or flicked themselves as though an invisible hand turned them. Something about the air felt charged, and now and then I caught glimpses of silhouettes drifting across aisles, never quite solid, as if the library not only collected books but also the souls of past readers who lingered in a half-existence. My pulse quickened when I spotted a shelf labeled an archaic script that read Accounts of the Departed, each tome containing personal stories from individuals officially listed as missing, entire testimonies of their last known sightings, scribbled in shaky handwriting. As I tugged one from the shelf, my mind reeled at the possibility these were the final words of those who entered this place and never returned. But the text script shifted before my eyes, paragraphs rearranging themselves, forming new sentences that whispered an invitation to keep reading. A dull ache formed at the base of my skull, and I realized that for every second I spent in the library, time felt distorted, my sense of how long I'd wandered fracturing into confusion, as if minutes and hours bled into each other without boundary. Eerie echoes started to fill the corridors, soft weeping, frantic page-turning, and the rustle of footfalls that ceased the moment I tried to locate their source, lending the place a haunted atmosphere more potent than any normal library's hush. Terror warred with scholarly curiosity, but curiosity won out often enough to keep me moving, lured by the promise of unimaginable knowledge, or perhaps the twisted arrogance that I could glean the library's secrets without falling into its trap. At times, I passed side rooms containing reading tables where a single occupant might slouch, face buried in a book, unmoving for what felt like entire cycles of my breath, as if transfixed or comatose, their presence more statue than living being. My attempts to speak to them yielded no response, and one time, when I reached out to gently tap a figure's shoulder, their form dissolved into swirling dust that reassembled a few feet away, continuing to read as though I hadn't existed. Fighting mounting panic, I pressed onward, my fingers trailing over spines that seemed to vibrate under my touch, the quiet hum intensifying whenever I paused near certain volumes as though they recognized me, summoning me to open them. Without warning, the corridor opened into a vast hall, its ceiling lost in darkness, shelves spiraling upward in multiple tiers, accessible by narrow iron staircases that twisted around columns carved with cryptic symbols, a testament to the library's impossible architecture. Standing there, dwarfed by the monumental scope of the place, I felt the walls of reality quiver, for no normal building could contain such boundless space, and a wave of claustrophobic awe made me gasp. Something stirred overhead, a massive shape that glided across the gloom, and my blood ran cold imagining a phantom librarian or guardian prowling the upper shelves, ready to pounce on intruders who dared linger too long. The flicker of an old lamp from a distant corner caught my attention, and I gravitated toward it, thinking perhaps another soul was there, someone who might share how to escape this labyrinth, or at least confirm that I wasn't alone in my predicament. Each step brought me deeper into the hall's heart, the lighting growing erratic, with some areas bathed in a weird phosphorescence seeping from cracks in the floor, while others lay drenched in absolute blackness that no lamp could penetrate. My breathing grew shallow as I realized I was likely miles, or entire worlds, away from the library's entrance, the path behind me hopelessly lost in the twisting corridors, and the faint memory of signing my name in that ledger began to weigh like a chain around my neck. I tried to mark my route by leaving scraps of paper or scribbling chalk arrows on the shelves, but each time I circled back, the marks vanished, or the entire corridor rearranged, as though the library itself was alive, rejecting my attempts to navigate. In desperation, I sank to the floor at one juncture, rummaging through my bag for the meager supplies I'd brought, heart dropping at the realization that my watch read a time impossible for the short period I believed I'd spent here, indicating hours or even a full day had slipped by. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I glimpsed a ragged figure dart across the next aisle, letting out a gasp of recognition when I realized it wore clothing from another era, a battered cloak that looked centuries out of date. Summoning courage, I hurried after it, ignoring the pounding in my ears, but the figure was gone, leaving only a single shoe behind, its leather cracked and peeling, an archaic style I'd only seen in museum exhibits. My throat constricted at the evidence that countless visitors from numerous epochs must have wandered these passages, never finding the exit, each leaving behind fragments of themselves in a silent testament to the library's appetite for the lost. Suddenly, my flashlight's beam caught a glimpse of a sign reading, "Reference Desk," in block letters overhead, the first plain English text I'd seen in hours, and I rushed toward it, hoping it might lead me to the building's nerve center, or perhaps a caretaker who understood the madness at play. Rounding the corner, I found a modest alcove with a wooden desk strewn with notes, quills, and a single ledger that mirrored the one at the entrance, though this one bore a disturbing difference. Pages upon pages of names, scrawled in various scripts, the last line still damp with fresh ink. My own name gleamed there, underlined in crimson, accompanied by a small notation in a script I couldn't decipher, though it somehow conveyed a dark finality, as if sealing my fate. Heart pounding, I flipped through earlier pages, seeing thousands of names from across centuries, each marked with a symbol that might indicate their outcome. Some bearing an emblem of a half-open door, others a closed lock, a few scribbled out entirely. I realized with horrified clarity that this was the record of every soul claimed by the Library of the Missing, each signatory doomed to wander the stacks forever, or to vanish into obscure annexes never again glimpsed by mortal eyes. Determined not to join their ranks, I tore out the page containing my name, though the ledger's paper felt unnaturally cold and slippery, and as soon as I crumpled it, the entire room trembled, the shelves rattling as though an alarm had been triggered. The overhead lights flared, casting harsh shadows in the shape of books and columns that writhed across the walls, and an ear-splitting moan echoed through the corridors, reminiscent of a monstrous hush from the library's bowels. Panic seized me, but I clutched that torn page as a lifeline, racing back through any corridor that seemed familiar, though the floor felt like it tilted under me, doors appearing and vanishing in a carnival of madness. At last, by some miracle, or perhaps an improbable alignment of cosmic luck, I spotted the main foyer with its heavy entrance door, the tall robed librarian from earlier standing guard, arms raised in silent fury. My mind screamed that I was out of time, so I hurled the crumpled page into a flickering brazier perched on a pillar, watching the paper blacken and curl, hoping that in destroying my name, I might nullify the library's hold. The librarian let out a silent scream, turning to dust that swirled in frantic spirals, while the stone floor cracked beneath me, each fracture streaming pale light, as if the entire building was dissolving under its own unnatural tension. With every shred of will, I lunged for the door, yanking it open to a blast of cold night air, and stumbled outside, collapsing onto wet pavement in a deserted alley that smelled of trash and stale rain, heart roaring in my ears. When I turned back, the building was gone, replaced by a row of boarded-up shops and no sign of a towering, windowless facade, as if the library had never existed in that spot, erasing itself the moment I crossed the threshold. Gasping for breath, I felt an immense wave of nausea, half expecting the corridor illusions to drag me back. All I saw were flickering street lamps and a stray cat slinking behind a dumpster, blissfully mundane. Exhaustion crushed me, yet I forced myself to check my bag, finding the torn ledger page reduced to ashes, confirming that maybe, just maybe, my act severed the library's claim on my soul, though my limbs still trembled with residual dread. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize everything as a delirious dream, but the bruises on my arms and the impossible gap in my memory made denial futile, forcing me to acknowledge that the Library of the Missing was as real as the terror it spawned. Though I survived, my mind was forever branded by the hush of those endless shelves, and the knowledge of countless others still wandering inside, trapped in that liminal domain beyond the mortal world's comprehension. Each time I pass an old building or see a library sign at dusk, my heart flutters, a sliver of me still bracing for the possibility that behind some unsuspecting door lurks that same labyrinth of silent books, waiting to claim another unwary seeker. I spent the next several days in a fog of disbelief, unable to shake the sense that my escape from the library of the missing had been little more than a delirious dream. Yet every time I touched the lingering bruises on my arms or replayed the memory of tearing my name from that cursed ledger, I felt a chill that confirmed the nightmare was very real. My mind teetered between panic and obsession, torn by the knowledge that countless souls might still be wandering those infinite shelves, their footprint erased, their voices lost among the silent tomes. And for a while, I couldn't decide if I should keep my experience secret or risk sounding deranged by sharing it with anyone. Although I tried to focus on mundane tasks, grocery shopping, replying to emails, paying bills, I found it impossible to banish the library's hush from my thoughts, each quiet moment triggering flashbacks of echoing corridors and flickering sconces. Even worse, I started seeing fleeting shapes in peripheral vision, silhouettes that seemed to resemble the robed librarian or half-glimpsed figures skulking behind doorways, which would vanish the moment I looked straight at them, leaving my heart pounding and my breath ragged. Nighttime brought fresh torments, my dreams riddled with endless rows of books that whispered my name, spines contorting into expressions of silent pleading, while overhead lights swung in unseen drafts, as if mocking my every attempt to banish the memory. In those restless hours, I sometimes awoke convinced I smelled the library's peculiar odor, damp paper and ancient dust, and I would scramble to my window to confirm I was still in my cramped apartment, not locked behind some labyrinth door. Eventually, my friends noticed my mounting paranoia, but I deflected their concern by blaming academic stress, refusing to mention the library for fear they dismiss me as delusional or worse, decide to investigate on their own. My best confidant, however, was Harriet, a fellow scholar who studied obscure texts. She once teased me about chasing legends, but when she saw how genuinely shaken I was, she urged me to confide in her, promising an open mind and absolute discretion. Summoning courage, I recounted the entire ordeal, stumbling upon the building, signing the ledger, the labyrinthine shelves, and the final dash to freedom. And though Harriet's eyes widened with each new detail, she didn't interrupt or express disbelief, only a quiet horror that matched my own. She asked if I had any tangible proof. I could only show her the bruises and the tattered notes I'd used in my earlier research, plus a partial description of the ledger page I'd burned, leaving no physical trace of that otherworldly domain. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, Harriet believed me, or at least believed that I believed, and she suggested we methodically trace the steps that led me to the library's entrance, hoping we might find residual clues or at least confirm whether the structure had once existed in that neighborhood. At first, I resisted the idea of returning to that portion of the city, terrified that the library might lure me back inside with no second chance at escape, but Harriet convinced me we could approach in daylight, keep a safe distance, and rely on her calm objectivity to gauge any anomalies. So one bright afternoon, hearts hammering, we drove to the rundown neighborhood where I recalled seeing that windowless facade, only to discover a row of abandoned storefronts with no sign of the imposing building I remembered, as though it had never been there at all. Harriet, meticulously thorough, interviewed some nearby residents, though most claimed these streets had been derelict for years, with no new constructions or suspicious demolitions, leaving us at a dead end that reaffirmed the library's ability to erase itself from the world's memory. Undeterred, Harriet proposed we scour older city maps and property registries, hoping to spot discrepancies that might indicate a shifting or unlisted location, but each record we found showed only standard plots, no mention of a large, unmarked structure or anything resembling a labyrinthine repository for lost souls. My anxiety soared each time we turned up empty, for part of me feared that if the library truly roamed the city, it could pop up anywhere, its corridors beckoning fresh victims at random, and Harriet's logical mind began to grasp the severity of what we faced. To my relief, Harriet's composure never wavered. She systematically combed through historical documents, occasionally unearthing obscure references to vanished reading halls or rumored arcane libraries, rumored to devour knowledge seekers, though none explicitly named the Library of the Missing. Her persistence led us to a musty reading room in an old municipal building, where we uncovered a single cryptic footnote, a 19th century lawsuit in which a widow claimed her husband disappeared inside the library without windows, returning only in a catatonic trance with a strange ledger page clutched in his hand. That man, according to the footnote, died soon after, raving about wandering stacks that defied geometry, his final words warning the living never to sign their names if confronted by a silent librarian, or risk being cataloged for eternity. Though Harriet tried to appear calm, I saw the way her hands trembled on that yellowed sheet of paper, the unspoken confirmation that my story wasn't an isolated episode but part of a recurring phenomenon stretching back through local lore. We realized with growing dread that no one had ever documented a surefire way to destroy or permanently banish this spectral repository, leaving us to wonder if it thrived on the hush of secrecy or if it systematically culled those who pried too deeply. Unsure where else to turn, Harriet and I agreed to approach a local archivist named Madeline, known for her eccentric expertise in lost architecture, whose private collection included diaries from explorers who vanished off the official map. Madeline, upon hearing Harriet's carefully phrased questions, grew visibly pale, admitting she'd read of a homeless library that manifested sporadically across centuries, always preluded by rumors of missing persons, each final sighting describing a door carved with serpentine symbols. She escorted us to her private study, showing us a series of hand-drawn sketches from various decades, all purportedly describing the same place, a tall, windowless structure with minimal external ornamentation, and the interior rumored to shift in scale. Some sketches hinted at an archaic reading room with candelabras fashioned from twisted iron, while others depicted a multi-tier labyrinth lit by luminescent shelves, always culminating in the theme of signing the ledger, which locked you inside its domain. I felt a pang of déjà vu with each drawing, recalling the moaning hush of the corridor, the desperate feeling of trudging forward while the library seemed to change behind me, and Harriet took frantic notes, determined to see if any pattern in the building's appearances might be gleaned. Madeline, noticing how shaken I was, asked if I had personally encountered the library, and though Harriet nodded hesitantly, I found myself at a loss for words, the memory too raw for me to articulate well. The archivist offered a bleak insight. If you truly escaped, you're one of the rare ones, explaining that recorded accounts typically ended abruptly, the authors vanishing or succumbing to madness. My pulse quickened, half in relief that I wasn't insane, half in terror at the notion that the library might still have a claim on me, a claim that might manifest as illusions or nightmares, or perhaps a second chance to finish the job it started. Harriet inquired whether any account existed of someone returning to the library deliberately to free those trapped inside, but Madeline only shook her head, stating that once the building vanished, its location would remain unknown until it chose to reappear, at which point it was already too late for new victims. We left Madeline's study with heavier hearts, each step echoing the hopelessness of thousands lost in the labyrinth, and as we exited onto the street, Harriet asked if I felt a moral obligation to try and rescue them should the library emerge again. My stomach twisted at the thought, for every fiber of me wanted to avoid that cursed realm, yet the notion of simply ignoring the plight of countless souls weighed on my conscience, the guilt that gnawed at me even in quiet moments. Meanwhile, the nightmares resumed in full force. I found myself re-entering the library's foyer in dream after dream, always hearing the robed librarian's silent presence behind me, the corridor's books rustling in anticipation, certain I'd be devoured if I lingered. Harriet, too, confessed to experiencing disturbing dreams involving shelves that warped into grotesque shapes, the spines forming faces that gaped silently at her, as though she'd been tainted simply by investigating my account. In a bid for relief, we turned to Felipe, an amateur paranormal investigator Harriet knew from a local ghost hunting forum, who listened to her story with rapt fascination, claiming that cursed places can sometimes be exorcised by dispersing the energy that anchors them to our reality. Felipe suggested a mass disclosure, proposing we publicly broadcast the library's existence so it would become a matter of widespread skepticism, draining it of the secrecy that might fuel its intangible nature, but Harriet argued that cynics might dismiss it or worse, treat it like a challenge. Torn, we debated how best to proceed, worried that going public might lure thrill seekers who'd actively seek out the library if even the slimmest clue emerged, endangering them further. In the end, we compromised by discreetly sharing the gist of my experience with a handful of trusted colleagues who specialized in anomalous folklore, instructing them to approach it academically, as though analyzing a dark fairy tale, hoping to defend the library by confining it to a safe realm of critical discourse. To my surprise, a few colleagues recognized parallels to other living architecture myths found worldwide, each describing labyrinthine domains that appear and vanish, claiming lost travelers, though none matched the exact name or ledger signature detail. Through these cross-references, Harriet discovered one obscure piece of text, a medieval treatise recounting a monastic labyrinth that demanded names in a book that the structure might feed upon the vow of presence, an eerie echo of the library's ledger ritual. Though enlightening, none of these sources provided a definitive solution, only cautionary tales that hammered home the library's unstoppable cycle: appear, ensnare, vanish, repeat. Meanwhile, Harriet and I struggled with daily life, each new morning overshadowed by the question of when the library might come calling, or if we might spot an incongruous facade on a random street corner, beckoning me specifically. Shadows in quiet hallways made me flinch, The rustle of pages in an ordinary bookstore set my pulse racing, and Harriet found herself unwilling to enter large libraries, fearing a sudden shift into that warped reality. In an attempt to cling to normalcy, I resumed my academic duties, delivering lectures on less controversial subjects, though my gaze often drifted to the windows, scanning for a dark shape that might herald the library's reemergence. Harriet, perhaps to ground herself, dived deeper into research on architectural anomalies, occasionally stumbling upon new fragments of legend that hinted the library harbored not just lost knowledge, but malevolent consciousness grown from centuries of devouring unwary scholars. One evening, as the wind howled outside my apartment, Harriet phoned me in a panic, claiming she found a mention of a blood oath shelf believed to store the diaries of those who signed the ledger but escaped. Each diary said to transform into an open invitation for the library to reclaim them. My heart froze at the implication. If such diaries existed, it meant the library actively pursued those who fled, hoping to lure them back with illusions of rescue attempts for others. Harriet's voice shook as she admitted she feared we might be walking time bombs, each day risking a slip that would let the library reclaim me, especially since she too had become entwined in my escape story, possibly marking her as well. Sleep grew impossible, each passing hour haunted by the question of whether I'd inadvertently left behind some spiritual residue the library could exploit, whether it would forcibly reappear in my path. Though every day the city outside remained mundane, my nerves shredded further, convinced the ordinary facade masked a looming shadow that only needed the right moment to peel back and reveal the labyrinth once again. Harriet and Felipe put their heads together, proposing an old-school protective measure, a vigil in a consecrated space, with wards meant to sever metaphysical ties, a ritual borrowed from medieval exorcism texts that claimed to shield travelers from cursed domains. Desperate, I agreed, so we gathered in a small chapel late at night, the caretaker allowing us a solitary hour, and lit candles in a circle while Felipe chanted a half-Latin litany, Harriet gripping my hand, her eyes brimming with anxious hope. In the chapel's quiet reverence, I closed my eyes and focused on rejecting the library's hush, envisioning the gargoyles, the infinite shelves, the robed figure, and mentally sealing them behind an invisible barrier, as though building a fortress in my mind that no corridor could breach. I felt a tingling pressure behind my ears, a mounting tension that made me grunt in discomfort, and at the chance crescendo, it released, leaving me gasping as though I'd surfaced from underwater, Harriet experiencing a similar jolt. Though exhausted, we shared a cautious optimism that night, suspecting we'd cut the library's psychic tether, at least for now, granting us some measure of respite if not complete safety. The following morning dawned bright, no nightmares, no flickers of shadow librarians in the corners of my apartment, Harriet reporting similar peaceful sleep, fueling our belief that we might have thwarted the library's immediate grasp. However, a gnawing emptiness replaced the fear, an odd sense of regret that in banishing the library's illusions, we'd also lost any chance of freeing those presumably trapped within, a moral quandary that weighed heavily on my conscience. Harriet reminded me that we were only human, that we couldn't wage war against a supernatural labyrinth single-handedly, and that the best we could do was survive, preserving our sanity and warning others if the library's rumor ever reemerged. Over time, we perfected our vigil routine, performing many rituals whenever we felt a tremor of dread, reaffirming our mental walls, refusing to let the corridor's hush creep back, and gradually the echoes of that domain receded to distant memory. Months passed with no sign of the library's return, and Harriet eventually found the courage to travel abroad for an academic fellowship, leaving me to hold down the fort in our hometown, the two of us promising to alert each other the instant we sensed anything amiss. Occasionally, I spotted an odd old building in a random alley, or saw rumors online about missing persons with references to strange reading rooms, and each instance triggered a spike of fear, but closer inspection always revealed something benign or unrelated, letting me breathe easier. The city itself felt normal again, though I never forgot the labyrinth's hush, nor the robed librarian's silent demand that I sign my name, the memory echoing each time I scrawled my signature on everyday documents, bank slips, letters, packages, and paused with dread. In the final analysis, Harriet and I emerged from the ordeal battle-worn yet alive, forging a mutual vow to remain vigilant, continuing to share notes on bizarre sightings or potential new leads, hoping that if the library of the missing ever manifested again, we could find a way to steer innocence clear. Late at night, I sometimes reread my scribbled accounts of the labyrinth, the ledger, the shadowy caretaker, and wonder if I was merely a fleeting footnote in that library's centuries-long existence, a trivial anomaly that managed to slip free. Yet as time carried on, the library receded into the margins of my life, overshadowed by routine joys and sorrows, replaced by simpler challenges that felt blissfully grounded in normal reality, though the scars of memory remained. On calm evenings, I'd sit on my balcony, stargazing without terror, no flicker of misplaced architecture glinting in the distance, no hush of phantom pages turning in my ears, only the gentle hum of traffic and the comforting presence of an unremarkable skyline. And so Key Point 2 ended in a precarious détente with the library's dread, Harriet and I forging protective rituals, burying ourselves in research to ensure we recognized any sign of resurgence, all the while tasting the bittersweet relief that, for now, the labyrinth's haunting corridors had closed themselves off from our immediate reality. I never expected the library of the missing to seep back into my life the way it did, but nearly a year after my escape, I found myself standing on the edge of the old campus courtyard at dusk, feeling an unexplainable pull in the pit of my stomach. The daily routine that had once distracted me, attending lectures, grading papers, catching up with colleagues, had settled into a comfortable lull, but a creeping sense of unease had been gathering in the back of my mind, as though some unseen door was about to swing open. One evening, a frail-looking student approached me after class, her gaze skittish, whispering about strange sightings of a tall, windowless building in a disused corner of the university grounds, claiming she'd heard muffled voices echo from within. At first, my blood ran cold, and I tried to dismiss her story as a rumor fueled by campus folklore, but her trembling voice and haunted eyes reminded me of my own fear, prompting me to investigate quietly. Despite the protective rituals Harriet and I had practiced, I felt them falter in my chest as soon as I stepped onto that patch of overgrown lawn behind the old science annex, heart pounding at the possibility that the library might have manifested anew. My initial survey showed nothing unusual, just a weed-choked path, a row of rusty dumpsters, and walls stained with graffiti, but the student insisted she'd seen a door materialize after sundown, visible only when the shadows lengthened at precisely the right angle. Intrigued yet terrified, I paced the site for hours on subsequent nights, flashlight in hand, scanning every inch of battered brick, until on the third dusk, the temperature around me dropped abruptly, and I saw a faint outline shimmer against the building's blank wall, like a mirage forming from tattered moonlight. My throat constricted as I recognized that subtle distortion, similar to the facade I'd encountered in my first approach to the library, the air itself bending to reveal a shape that shouldn't exist, beckoning me like a silent dare. Though I quivered with dread, I recalled Harriet's words. If the library reappeared, we had a moral choice: warn others away, or attempt a rescue mission for those who might already be trapped inside. Fear warred with a lingering guilt at having escaped while so many souls remained lost, so I forced myself to stand my ground, watching as the outline solidified into a tall, arched door bearing serpentine carvings, faintly visible in the moonlight. Each passing second throbbed with tension, yet curiosity burned through my veins. Had the library singled me out again, or did it appear for someone else and I merely stumbled upon its opening? The student who had tipped me off lingered at a safe distance, her eyes wide with both horror and awe, and I felt compelled to gesture for her to retreat before I even tested the door's handle, not wanting her innocence consumed by that labyrinth. She nodded shakily, stepping behind a row of bushes, though she stayed close enough to watch in case something went wrong, perhaps hoping to see if my tale of a shifting library was genuine. Each step toward the door felt like wading through deep water, gravity pressing down on my shoulders, the sense that the corridor beyond might yank me inside the moment I let my guard slip. When at last my fingertips touched the iron doorknob, I noticed faint runes etched along its metal surface, similar to the archaic symbols Harriet and I had seen in sketches, confirming that this was no ordinary structure. With a quiet exhale, I glanced over my shoulder at the silent campus grounds, wondering if I should call Harriet for backup. But I suspected time was short and the library might vanish again if I hesitated. Summoning every scrap of will, I turned the knob and pushed, bracing myself for the hush of those infinite shelves, only to find my flashlight beam hitting a cramped foyer with peeling wallpaper and a single desk that looked more modern than the ancient architecture I recalled. Confusion rippled through me until I realized the library could alter its outward decor, perhaps to better camouflage in different locations or eras, and I recognized the same suffocating stillness that had chilled my bones before. A robed figure stood behind a desk, its form backlit by an oil lamp, features obscured by a deep hood, though I sensed the same silent malice as the librarian I'd once encountered, a presence that thrummed with the library's power. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, but I tightened my grip on the flashlight, determined not to sign anything this time. No ledger, no vow, no record of my name that could re-ensnare me in the labyrinth's domain. Still, the librarian extended a bony hand holding a feather quill, as though mocking me with an unspoken demand, and I backed away, focusing on the protective mantras Harriet and I had rehearsed. When the figure refused to retreat, I forced a shaky smile and spoke aloud, telling it I knew its game, that I would not be claimed so easily, my voice echoing strangely against the narrow walls. The librarian hissed in frustration, or so I interpreted the faint rasp, and slowly turned, gliding down a corridor that opened onto a row of shelves, each lined with books that pulsed with heartbeat-like rhythm, as if anticipating fresh victims. Deciding I had come too far to turn back, I crept after it. Though I kept my distance, flashlight beam dancing over spines that bore titles and shifting script, reminiscent of the illusions I'd faced in my first ordeal. Occasionally, the corridor branched, revealing half-lit reading alcoves or dusty side rooms. But I remembered Harriet's instructions: do not wander aimlessly, do not yield to curiosity about the volumes, or risk the labyrinth enwrapping me again. My voice trembled as I called out, hoping perhaps to find signs of any living soul trapped here, though the library answered only with a whisper of cold air that caressed my cheeks like a silent exhale. At one juncture, I saw a shadow dart across the far aisle, prompting me to hurry forward, convinced it might be a survivor or a newly captured visitor, but turning the corner revealed only an empty walkway lined with battered tomes. Another corridor displayed a half-open door with a faint light spilling out, and my heart nearly seized with the hope that someone inside might be waiting. But caution held me back from rushing in, mindful of the illusions the library used to lure me deeper before. Pressing my ear against the door, I heard the rustle of pages turning, accompanied by hushed murmurs in a language I didn't recognize, punctuated by occasional sobs that made my skin crawl. Gathering my courage, I nudged the door open and caught sight of a figure kneeling amongst scattered books, head bowed, its hands trembling as it clutched an old volume. My attempt to speak caused the figure to snap upright, and I realized this was a young man, perhaps a university student, face streaked with tears, eyes hollow with weeks or months of fear, though we might have only been in the library for hours by normal reckoning. He babbled about searching for a single text that contained an exit path, some rumored index of departures, but each reference led him in circles, and he feared the librarian might soon punish him for rifling through restricted shelves. Compassion swelled in me, and I asked how he'd entered this place, but his answers emerged in frantic spurts, glimpsing the building's door on campus, stepping inside for a quiet reading spot, then finding himself lost as the corridors elongated around him. He pleaded for help, clinging to my arm as though I were a lifeline, insisting we must find that elusive index if we hoped to escape, believing it described a ritual to force an exit. Though uncertain whether such a book existed or if it was a ploy by the library, I couldn't abandon him. So we moved together through dim corridors, scanning spines for any mention of the index, each second accompanied by the creeping dread that the librarian or some living shadow might intercept us. At times, I glimpsed flickers of Harriet's face in my mind, remembering how we'd sworn never to re-enter this domain alone. Yet fate had propelled me here, and I felt obligated to assist whoever was trapped, if only to justify my own survival the first time around. Our search led us into a grand reading hall where the shelves soared into darkness, and the air vibrated with a subtle hum, as if the library's consciousness pooled there, intensifying the closer we drew to a towering row of volumes marked by unearthly symbols. My companion seized on one battered tome that emitted a faint glow, opening it to reveal pages of shifting script, and as he read, his face contorted in awe and terror, telling me it indeed described exit rights, but also warned of dire consequences if the library's power was challenged too directly. The instructions demanded a sacrifice of personal memory. A piece of the traveler's identity burned in a particular brazier, accompanied by whispered incantations, and the library might open a door for them, though it was unclear if both of us could pass with only one sacrifice. A wave of nausea hit me as I recalled the cataclysmic events that happened when I burned my name from the ledger during my escape, wondering if this was the same principle or a cunning trap the library crafted to push us into a corner. The young man, desperate, insisted we attempt the ritual, but I hesitated, remembering the robed librarian's fury and the possibility that we'd only escalate the labyrinth's wrath, condemning ourselves to a permanent shelf among the missing. My reflection in a dusty mirror by the hall's entrance caught my eye, and for a split second, I thought I saw the corridor behind me winding infinitely, so I snapped my gaze away, focusing on the battered tome's final lines that spoke of a hidden brazier near the library's foundation stone. Encouraged by the text, my companion led me deeper into the hall, rummaging through side alcoves until we found a small stone dais that might serve as the foundation, and there, set into the floor, was a metal brazier etched with swirling patterns reminiscent of the serpents on the library's door. The instructions demanded we each tear out a page of personal significance, some artifact tied to memory, and feed it to the brazier's flame while chanting certain syllables, forging a metaphysical key. In a trembling motion, I tore a page from my personal journal that I always carried in my satchel, one containing a cherished recollection of a childhood mentor, feeling a pang of guilt and sorrow as I prepared to sacrifice it. My companion tore a snapshot from his wallet, presumably a dear memory he clung to, tears glistening in his eyes as he approached the brazier, both of us locked in this desperate gambit. Lighting the pages proved easier than expected. A single match ignited them, and the brazier's flame flared bright, radiating a cold luminescence rather than heat, as though fueled by intangible dread. We began reciting the incantation from the glowing tome, our voices shaking, echoing across the silent shelves, and I felt the library's hush intensify, the shadows lengthening as a low moan reverberated through the structure. Abruptly, a swirling wind kicked up around us, spinning the ashes of our memories into a spiral that soared toward the ceiling, which opened like a veil, revealing a dark void that flickered with the faint outline of a door. The robed librarian emerged from the gloom, gliding swiftly toward us, arms raised in a silent snarl, but the swirling wind kept it at bay, pushing back its approach with each line of the incantation we uttered, our eyes locked on the ephemeral door overhead. My companion shouted for me to hold steady, and we finished the final syllables, a thunderous crack reverberating, causing the shelves to quake and books to tumble, as though the library reeled from our defiance, each volume fluttering in angry protest. At last, a sudden column of light descended from the gaping ceiling, enveloping us, and I clutched my companion's hand, praying this was the exit rather than another trap, heart pounding so fiercely I could hardly breathe. We were lifted, gravity twisting, the robed librarian's silhouette flailing below us, and my final glimpse of the labyrinth was a chaos of shifting corridors, unraveling like threads, the entire library fragmenting under the strain of our assault. Darkness consumed us, followed by a wrenching sensation that felt like being pulled through thick mud, and then we collapsed onto a patch of wet grass beneath a starless sky, coughing and panting for air, stunned to find ourselves outside. We lay there trembling, the library nowhere in sight, just an empty clearing behind the campus science annex, the young man's photograph still smoldering in his hand, reduced to ash, and my ripped journal page likewise extinguished. My companion wept with relief, though an emptiness clouded his eyes, as if the sacrifice of those memories left a permanent wound in his heart, a piece of him lost forever. Shaken to my core, I realized we had managed something unheard of, forcibly extracting ourselves from the library of the missing a second time, rescuing at least one trapped soul from its clutches. Yet the cost weighed heavily, and I suspected the library's fury might linger, skulking in the recesses of reality, waiting to rebuild itself in some other hidden location, yearning for new signatories. In that silent, moonlit field, I helped the young man to his feet, exchanging a resolute look of mutual survival. Though neither of us knew what to say, victory felt hollow with the knowledge we had merely escaped, not dismantled, the labyrinth's existence. With a final nod, we parted ways, him stumbling toward the dormitories to reclaim his shattered life, me left alone with the horrifying confirmation that once again, I had trespassed on the library's domain. Wandering home, I vowed never to let complacency lull me again, for if the library of the missing could manifest so arbitrarily, it might ensnare more unsuspecting souls, my only hope being to remain vigilant and spread hushed warnings to those who might see a tall, windowless facade beckoning in the shadows. I spent the following months watching the world around me with new wariness, burdened by the knowledge that the library of the missing could materialize again without warning, even in places I once considered safe, leaving me perpetually on guard for that telltale hush or the faint glimmer of a door that shouldn't exist. My nights were plagued by fresh nightmares, not only of labyrinthine corridors but also of faces, scores of people who might still be trapped inside, each pair of eyes pleading for rescue, forming a silent chorus that gnawed at my conscience. Harriet returned for her fellowship around this time, drawn by the urgency in my emails, and though she was shocked to learn I had ventured into the library's domain again, she admired my resolve to save the young student, even if the outcome left me more haunted than ever. Each time we discussed the library, Harriet and I felt the temperature in the room drop, as though the very mention of that dread institution brought a piece of it into our midst, a subtle reminder that some curses feed on attention. Tired of living in constant dread, we decided to attempt a more direct confrontation. If we were to truly sever the library's hold on our city, or at least mitigate its appearances, we needed to gather enough lore and knowledge to stage a kind of final exorcism. We spent weeks immersing ourselves in obscure manuscripts, archiving stories from people who had glimpsed ephemeral reading rooms or recognized the robed librarian in half-remembered dreams, building a mosaic of partial truths we hoped would form a blueprint for banishing the labyrinth. During these late-night research sessions, Harriet often caught me staring into space, my mind replaying the sensation of that swirling wind and the luminous exit from the library, each memory fueling a grim determination that we had to do more than just run away. Felipe, the amateur ghost hunter who once tried cleansing the cursed tape in another ordeal, came back into our circle, intrigued by the idea of a mobile architectural entity that devoured knowledge seekers, volunteering his experience in protective rites and boundary spells. Under Felipe's guidance, we learned of an ancient ritual that required a tether to the library, a physical link that anchored it to our realm, and Harriet suggested I might serve as that tether, since I'd escaped twice and still carried the library's imprint in my psyche. The very notion made my stomach churn, for it implied I'd have to stand at the threshold once more, effectively inviting the library to manifest around me, so the ritual could be enacted, a dangerous gambit that might cost me my freedom if it failed. Harriet wrestled with the moral implications. Was it truly our place to hamper the library's cycles, potentially denying future scholars access to knowledge beyond mortal ken? Or should we prioritize the countless souls that could be rescued if the labyrinth's power was diminished? In the end, guilt and compassion prevailed. We felt that the library had claimed enough victims, and even if it offered unparalleled mysteries, its method, absorbing or entrapping unsuspecting readers, was too cruel to tolerate. Our plan took shape in a flurry of candlelit discussions and frantic note-taking, culminating in a proposed ceremony that combined Harriet's research on living architecture lore, Felipe's expertise in warding, and my personal memories of the labyrinth's innermost corridors. The first hurdle was finding a suitable site where the library might manifest again, ideally somewhere discreet so innocent bystanders wouldn't stumble into the crossfire, and we recalled the defunct industrial zone near the outskirts of town, a place rumored to house all manner of uncanny happenings. We reasoned that I, being the library's escaped occupant, could attempt to lure it there by performing a symbolic re-entry ritual, brandishing an item linked to my prior visits, specifically the fragment of the battered ledger page I had not fully burned the first time, a tiny corner that I tucked away without thinking. The day we chose for the final exorcism was drenched in a brooding atmosphere, dark clouds gathering overhead, as though the weather itself sensed we were about to challenge a centuries-old enigma. Harriet and Felipe arriving at the abandoned lot carrying backpacks of candles, chalk, and protective sigils. My hands trembled as I withdrew that charred paper scrap from a small pouch, recalling how I'd once attempted to destroy all ties to the ledger, yet a fragment survived in my possession, a silent testament to the library's tenacity. We arranged a broad circle in the cracked concrete, marking it with salt and chalk runes derived from Harriet's medieval texts, each line carefully inscribed to create a boundary we hoped could contain the library's presence and keep it from fully materializing. Felipe's approach was methodical. He guided me to stand at the circle's center while Harriet and he chanted in soft murmurs, coaxing the library's attention, the gloom around us thickening, the wind picking up as if in response to our call. My heart thumped violently when a faint shimmer appeared at the lot's edge, reminiscent of the doorway I'd seen on campus, and I clenched the charred paper in my fist, focusing on memories of signing the ledger, the corridors shifting around me, the robed librarian's silent demands. Slowly, the shimmer coalesced into a tall, vague outline, the edges flickering like an old film reel, and I felt that crushing hush descend, the air pressing on my lungs, signaling the library's approach. Harriet and Felipe continued chanting, though their voices wavered with the weight of that hush, each syllable echoing unnaturally, and I realized with a jolt that the library's domain was trying to overlap ours, rewriting the abandoned lot into one of its labyrinthine foyers. The robed silhouette of the librarian flickered into view at the threshold. Head tilted in annoyance, and I could practically sense its rage at being summoned rather than summoning me, a reversal of the predator-prey dynamic that fueled its existence. Desperation drove me forward. I lifted the charred paper scrap overhead, reciting Harriet's borrowed incantation that demanded the library relinquish its claim on those who had escaped, severing any leftover bond that might let it appear at will. Thunder boomed above us, the flicker intensifying until a half-formed corridor came into view, shelves drifting in half-existence, fading in and out of alignment, while an otherworldly moan coursed through the space, rattling the very ground beneath our feet. Harriet yelled for me to hold steady, reminding me not to break the chalk circle, so I forced myself to keep chanting, my voice cracking but resolute, challenging the labyrinth to release any souls it still held under my name, to unbind me from its intangible rosters once and for all. In response, the robed librarian advanced, a silent gliding motion that defied physics, crossing into the circle's perimeter, only to recoil when the salt barrier flared with an electric glow, as if repelling the entity's approach. Felipe took that moment to fling a handful of dried herbs into the circle's edge, intensifying the glow, each flame of the candles around us dancing higher, creating a ring of flickering light that pinned the librarian in place. The corridor behind it convulsed, the shelves warping in tortured angles, and ghostly shapes emerged, silhouettes of watchers or echoes of those trapped, pressing forward with frantic gestures, but unable to fully cross into our realm. My throat tightened, tears pricking in my eyes as I recognized the tragedy of so many half-lost souls suspended in the library's domain, perhaps awaiting rescue or release. Yet Harriet's chant insisted on closure rather than a reckless attempt to breach the labyrinth again. The robed librarian's hollow gaze fixated on me, and I heard a faint rattling, as though it was thrusting the ledger forward in some intangible dimension, demanding once more that I sign away my freedom or pay a final toll. Summoning the last vestiges of courage, I exhaled Harriet's final line, commanding the library to depart, to cease its pursuit, and to retreat into the void that spawned it, forfeiting all claims on those who had stood at its threshold. A thunderous crack split the air, the swirling illusions around the circle convulsed, and the robed librarian seemed to collapse inward on itself, dissolving into swirling ash that scattered across the starless sky, while the corridor behind it flickered violently, then winked out. For a moment, the air stilled, leaving us panting in a circle of fading candlelight, uncertain whether we'd truly succeeded or simply driven the library away temporarily, free to roam elsewhere. Harriet dropped to her knees, sobbing with relief, and Felipe clutched the front of his shirt, tears glistening in his eyes from the sheer intensity of the encounter, the swirling energies in the lot dissipating like a dying storm. I stood at the circle's center, chest tight, realizing I felt no hush or corridor illusions in my mind, no robed figure haunting my peripheral vision, as though a smothering weight had been lifted from my soul. Carefully, we dismantled the protective circle, unsure if we risked re-inviting the library by doing so, but the atmosphere remained calm, the gloom receding, revealing the cracked asphalt and abandoned buildings without a trace of supernatural distortion. For days after, we feared retribution, some cunning final gambit from the labyrinth, but none came, and Harriet insisted that by confronting the library head-on with a forced invocation, we'd effectively slammed the door shut on its ability to anchor itself around me. We spread quiet word among those we trusted that if the library ever manifested again, they should utilize Harriet's incantation and a strong protective circle to reject it, warning them not to attempt exploring it or retrieving the lost, as heartbreakingly impossible as that was. Though the emptiness of leaving behind so many souls still weighed on me, I gleaned solace in the idea that we'd at least pried its claws off our city for now, offering a measure of safety to potential victims. Harriet eventually resumed her fellowship abroad. Felipe turned his attention to other paranormal anomalies, and I did my best to slip back into normalcy, though the experiences had irrevocably shaped my worldview, leaving me warier of hidden doors and deserted alleys. Sometimes passersby asked about odd local legends or rumored reading rooms that vanish at dawn, and I'd smile with forced casualness, advising them to stick to well-lit libraries with official addresses, feigning ignorance of any deeper truths. In my private hours, I typed up a thorough account of everything: the hush of the library, the ledger, the corridors, the illusions, the final exorcism, preserving the details in a password-protected file I quietly labeled Case Library 0, something Harriet and I could reference if the labyrinth ever reared its head again. The nightmares, once so oppressive, receded into faint memories, though on rare occasions I'd wake to the echo of turning pages or glimpse the robed librarian in my half-lucid dreams, always fading when I mustered the will to remind myself the library's claim was severed. As time marched on, I found new joys in simple routines: an afternoon coffee with colleagues, a weekend trip to the countryside, a restful sleep absent monstrous architecture, and though I remained vigilant, I savored each mundane pleasure as proof the labyrinth no longer held me enthralled. My sense of compassion for others deepened, for I understood how easily one could be snatched away by forces beyond explanation, and I quietly supported local groups searching for missing persons, hoping to reduce the library's potential pool of unknowing prey. The city itself glimmered with an undercurrent of normal life: commerce, art, conversation, trivial gossip, and I realized I had once envied such everyday simplicity before my harrowing experiences, but now I embraced it wholeheartedly, cherishing the unremarkable as a treasure. As for Harriet, she thrived in her research abroad, occasionally emailing me references to other living architecture legends across the globe, each one lacking quite the same details as her labyrinth but reinforcing that the phenomenon of devouring buildings existed in various forms. She concluded that maybe these anomalies sprang from a shared cosmic root, or a primal hunger in certain places that feed on human curiosity, shaping themselves as libraries, tapes, or mansions, yet always demanding tributes in the form of lost souls. Though unsettled by that hypothesis, I took comfort in knowing Harriet was forging a quiet web of awareness, teaching future generations of researchers how to spot and resist such illusions, a subtle war to keep new watchers safe. Meanwhile, I found a fragile peace in daily solitude, turning to my own scholarship, focusing on less macabre pursuits, content to share smaller stories with the world rather than chase arcane mysteries that might yank me back into unearthly labyrinths. Now, as months roll into years since that final confrontation, I reflect on the library of the missing with a mixture of sadness and pride, recalling the faces, real or spectral, I witnessed among its shelves, and the fierce will Harriet and I wielded to push it away from our reality. No official record commemorates our triumph. No headlines declared we saved unsuspecting scholars from a roving labyrinth, but the hush of night, I sleep a little better knowing we performed a mercy of sorts, even if we couldn't free every soul. Should the library return in some other place, for some other person, my only prayer is that our quiet sabotage weakened it enough that they, too, might find a path out, or at least sense the cautionary presence we left behind like a protective echo on the wind. In the final measure, living with the memory of that haunting hush is a small price to pay for freedom, a scar that twinges whenever I see an oddly unmarked building or hear about an unexplained disappearance, yet it grants me a humility that keeps arrogance at bay. Harriet and I remain connected by a bond forged in those twisting corridors, reminding each other that no library is worth losing oneself forever, that some books, however tempting, must remain unread if we value life outside the page. In the end, I do not consider our victory absolute. The library of the missing may well be older than cities, anchored in the very concept of curiosity, unstoppable in the grand scheme, but we created a space for ourselves outside its infinite shelves. Each morning now, I watch the sun rise over a skyline untainted by illusions, footsteps anchored in real concrete rather than ephemeral aisles, my heart steady with the conviction that though I survive the library's call, I must remain vigilant, always ready to share my tale, to bar the way for those who might otherwise vanish. And so, having shaped my fate away from the labyrinth's hush, I find satisfaction in the unspoken pledge Harriet and I made to keep watch, to guide the unsuspecting away from that serpent-carved door if it ever appears again, and to cherish every breath in the open air, free from the hush of devouring pages. In this final sense, Key Point 4 draws the curtain on my journey with the library of the missing, a quiet resolution found in vigilance and empathy, a new chapter of life that respects the dreadful boundary we once crossed, and the simple grace of sunrise each day that no labyrinth can overshadow.